Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to welcome you back after what was a most interesting morning panel. I hear from those who were around that it was quite interesting, and certainly for those of us who only know the founders of CREASE through stories, it was a wonderful experience for us as well. I'm Jovana Knežević, the Associate Director of CREASE. And in fact, for those of you who might have seen an earlier version of the program, this panel was supposed to be chaired by Mary Dakin, one of my predecessors, who was Associate Director of CREASE from 1999 through 2006, and was actually at CREASE during the times that we will be hearing about from some of our presenters today, but unfortunately she had to withdraw her participation. I was looking forward to seeing her, and so I will be filling in for her at this panel. I will introduce our first two speakers together because they will both be speaking about the Berkeley Stanford program. Our first presenter is George Breslauer, who is a scholar of Soviet and post-Soviet and Russian politics and foreign relations. He joined the faculty of the Department of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley in 1971. He was appointed Chancellor's Professor in 1998. He also served as Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, the Chief Academic Officer of the Berkeley campus. He is author or editor of 12 books on Soviet and Russian politics and foreign relations. Most recently Gorbachev and Yeltsin as leaders, and has served as editor of the scholarly quarterly Post-Soviet Affairs since 1992. Following George's presentation, we will hear from Gail Lapidus, who is Senior Fellow Emerita at the Freeman Spogli Institute here at Stanford. She is also Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. And served as chair of the Berkeley Stanford program in Soviet and post-Soviet studies from 1985 to 1994. She is a specialist on Soviet society, politics, and foreign policy, and has authored and edited a number of books on these topics, including The New Russia, Troubled Transformation in 1995, The Soviet System in Crisis with Alexander Dolin in 1992, and Women in Soviet Society in 1979. So at this point, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to introduce just one slight correction so that you don't send me submissions. After 23 years, I stepped down as editor of Post-Soviet Affairs in December of 2015. So if you have submissions to the journal, send them to Timothy Fry of Columbia University. Thank you. Well, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. The panel this morning was just fabulous, and it was so exciting for me to hear the talks and the history and relive the history in my own mind and in my own emotions. It was also somewhat humbling in that I realized I've got a tough act to follow, and I hope I do justice to it. The Berkeley-Stanford Joint Program in Soviet international behavior came into existence in 1983, really only got off the ground in 1984. 83 was when the grant was announced from the Rockefeller Foundation. In 1984, it really started getting off the ground with new graduate students and new programs using the $1 million grant that had been given. That joint program lasted until 1994, so essentially a decade, and it then left each campus to do its own thing in this area rather than emphasize the jointness again, and I'll say a word about the rationale for that. But I will say that that decade was the most intellectually exciting and collegially rewarding decade of my life. I entered the Soviet field in 1966 when I started graduate school and Brezhnev was in power. I started at Berkeley in 1971 and Brezhnev was in power. I got tenure in 1979 and Brezhnev was in power. In 1982, finally, Brezhnev left the scene, and we got Andropov. We had momentary excitement. Then he died, and we got Chernenko, and I thought I was going to shoot myself because we were going right back to Brezhnev. But I hope it's not too cruel to say, fortunately, he died before long, and we got Gorbachev. And that was the initiation of this real period of excitement intellectually and collegially, because we were working together, both between Berkeley and Stanford and among the faculty on each campus. The driving forces behind our getting that grant were Alex Dahlin and Gail Lapidus. Numbers of us also worked with them on the proposal and on the lobbying, but they were really the academic entrepreneurs par excellence that made it possible. But what made the whole idea attractive of having a Berkeley-Stanford program on Soviet international behavior was how packed both campuses were with expertise on the Soviet Union and on Soviet foreign policy, at Stanford in particular, with Alex Dahlin, Alex George, David Holloway came on a few years later, Chip Blacker, Condi Rice. So this was an extraordinary opportunity to sort of put our heads together, work together, and the opportunity was realized in that decade. Fabulous graduate students flooded into the program. We had visitors both from across the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union. We had research and publications and public talks. There was endless excitement, and it was very difficult to decide how many events you could afford to miss intellectually, but how many events you could afford to attend in terms of time management. So, but nonetheless, when you're that excited about what's going on, it comes easily to get involved in everything. And the executive directors of the program added both expertise and administrative talents. They were scholars themselves and administrators par excellence. It started with Dennis Ross, then Richard Remnick, and Andy Cutchins, and then for the last quarter century, Ned Walker. And the executive directors of the centers at Stanford and Berkeley also, even though they were not executive directors of the Berkeley-Stanford program per se, but these were the contexts within which this exciting program was taking place. They added greatly to our ability to coordinate all of this. And Jack Coleman and Barbara Wojtek come immediately to mind. Also, both scholars and administrators. Now, I like to think of this decade as a drama in 5 acts. The research and training program was born in fear and fright. It evolved into hope after Gorbachev came to power, then became a source of fascination as his reforms in both domestic and foreign policy became increasingly radical. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, ended in momentary incredulity and disorientation. But throughout, the program became a vast tracking exercise in which interpretation of what we were seeing became a truly exhilarating experience, partly because it kept getting more and more radical and therefore more and more interesting. In addition to the Rockefeller grant, research and training funds flowed in from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Mellon Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and others. So let me just briefly outline this drama in 5 acts. Act 1, 1981 to 84, that's the prequel to the decade. It's pre-Gorbachev, but it's the context in which the Rockefeller grant was conceived and then executed. It was a frightening time. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, things went from bad to worse. The violent crackdown on solidarity, the rise of Ronald Reagan to power, his sharp and Manichaean rhetoric about the USSR, the evil empire, his massive increase in the defense budget. The Soviets rhetorically responded in kind. I don't remember exactly when nuclear winter became part of our television experience, whether that was after the grant was given or before. But in any case, this growing atmosphere of peril, and that's why I say born in fright, spurred the Rockefeller Foundation to mobilize expertise to analyze Soviet international behavior. Now, I personally think it was, though others may have different interpretations, it was clearly geared toward undercutting the Manichaean rhetoric and providing support for perspectives other than the image of the USSR as an irreconcilable antagonist, nothing more to talk about. It was officially announced, you might say, or portrayed as a response to the lack of graduate students in the field and the need to train a new generation of graduate students, and that indeed it was, though I do believe that if events had not gone from bad to worse in Soviet-American relations, that argument for the need for a new generation of specialists on the Soviet Union might not have been as compelling and might not have spurred the Rockefeller Foundation to launch this competition. Now, awards were made in 1983 to 3 centers: Columbia, the Harriman Institute, Berkeley Stanford program, and the UCLA RAND collaboration. It didn't bring in its first cohorts of graduate students until the fall of 1984. In the meantime, of course, the East-West tensions had gotten even worse. In 1983, under Andropov, we had and Reagan, we had the Strategic Defense Initiative, we had the Korean airliner shoot down with the unfortunate number 007 appearing to validate Soviet suspicions that this was a spy plane, which it was not, and they knew it. And afterwards, or later, at the end of that year, the Pershing II deployments in Europe, and NATO's Exercise Able Archer, which appeared to some observers as having caused a war scare in Moscow. So you might say BSP came none too soon, just in time to analyze Soviet behavior and Soviet perspectives at the worst point in Soviet-American relations in quite a while. The acronym for the Berkeley-Stanford program on Soviet international behavior was BSP-SIB, which led Alex Dallin, the consummate wit, to say that stands for best possible. Look at it, you'll see why. And while the skeptics and antagonists, of which there were a few, interpreted the acronym instead to mean bullshit possibly. But no sooner did we get started than Gorbachev came to power, and that initiated Act 2 of this drama. 1985-86, intriguingly, new rhetoric, new posturing, new appearance, new initiatives, new leadership style. They suggested something possibly quite reformist, but it was not yet clear what to make of it in the long term. Glasnost, new thinking, acceleration, these were some of the new phrases and new initiatives out of Moscow, but we did not yet know. We hoped, but we did not yet know. And that initiated Act 3, which I'll call 1987 to 89, radicalization of Gorbachev's policies at home and abroad. Now it started to get really interesting and exciting. It became clear that he was a radical reformist. It was not clear whether he'd get away with it or how far he would push radicalization, but it was clear that this was something fundamentally new, not to be gainsaid. And indeed, that is the point at which those of us most deeply involved in the program, became possibilists. Now, it was said this morning about Alex Dallin that he always wanted to emphasize that things were not essentialist, they could evolve. Well, possibilism in the literature on democratization is all about not prejudging conclusions, but taking an intellectual perspective that allows for the possible. And that's what was now happening. It was clear that his domestic and his foreign policies were a sharp break from the past. And BSP then turned into a vast and exciting tracking exercise and interpretation of this radicalization. And a singular focus on foreign policy no longer made sense, especially if the dramatic softening of Soviet foreign policy was driven by perceived domestic imperatives. So we now started studying and interpreting changes in society, the emergence of civil society, politics with open contestation, new rules of representation, and in 1989, even competitive elections, and foreign policy where it was clear that Gorbachev was refusing to save East European regimes from overthrow, was withdrawing from most third world commitments, was accepting already in 1987 the INF Treaty with the double zero, even though the United States would not give up SDI. This was all a bundle of interconnected domestic and foreign policy changes. Act 4 was 1989 to 91. Gorbachev shows that he is willing to push well beyond the radicalization, even though there were moments in the Baltics, for example, of concern that he had to cover his right-wing flanks. And the USSR starts to come apart. And here the central question then became, could the Soviet Union survive as a single political entity? And now, during this period, our colleagues Ken Jowett and Martin Amelia got into the act. They had not been conceivers of the joint Berkeley-Stanford program proposal. They had been publishing and speaking on the side, typically with skepticism. Jowett was arguing at the time, this is not democratization, this is disintegration. And if you don't adopt that frame, you won't understand what is to come. Meanwhile, Amelia published an article, Martin Amelia, a historian at Berkeley, published an article under the pseudonym Z, in which he predicted that the Soviet Union could not survive this program that Gorbachev was pushing, and it was headed inexorably for collapse. They were contrarian voices on the Berkeley campus, and they were decidedly not possibilists in intellectual spirit. And then came Act 5 of the drama, 1991 to 1994. There was no longer a USSR. Democratization, economic marketization, and US-Russian collaboration were now central to the agenda of US-Soviet relations, or US-Russian relations after the collapse, and for the Berkeley-Stanford program. It continued to fascinate. Students continued to pour in, but this was a new stage. We now found that we had to expand our expertise, especially as we Soviet specialists were constantly being asked by colleagues in Moscow to give advice on how to democratize a Leninist system, how to decentralize a command economy and marketize a command economy. We didn't have special expertise on those topics, but we started reading widely in order to broaden our perspectives. We were all feeling our way. We didn't have easy answers. The colleagues in Moscow would take a number of years before they realized that we didn't have easy answers and that they'd have to find out for themselves as to how to steer this whole process. But these years were also exhilaratingly marked by unprecedented access in Moscow and the provinces to political actors and previously closed archives. So the possibilities for research seemed endless. And as we were excitedly watching for democratization and marketization, Ken Jowett was on the sidelines in his contrarian perspective, saying, watch out for the Leninist legacy. Don't forget the Leninist legacy. It's going to undermine everything you're trying to do. Around 1994, and especially with Gail Lapidus moving to Stanford, a move that I mourn to this day. I told Gail earlier that when I saw her, even though it's been a quarter of a century, when I saw her carrying that Stanford folder, I got a blip of remorse. With Gail's move to Stanford, we decided to dissolve the formerly joint program. But each campus continued to mobilize its impressive cohorts of faculty and students to conduct research and training on what we now called Soviet and post-Soviet studies. The focus on Soviet international behavior had become anachronistic. A singular focus on foreign policy was by now a distant memory. And if you were to focus on foreign policy, you had to at least root it in an understanding of the domestic context that might be driving whatever changes would be taking place in foreign policy. But even though the program, after 10 years of being up and running, dissolved jointly, it was the most exhilarating memory that I have of my time at Berkeley, my almost half century now at Berkeley. Most exhilarating intellectual memory. I've had exhilarating administrative experiences too. And how gratifying it has been to note not only the permanent impact on scholarship in the field that has come out of the publications from both Berkeley and Stanford, but the publications that have come out of our graduate students who have now become, in many, many cases, luminaries in the field of academia, and in many cases, less visible, but influential actors within both government and within the NGO sector. And of course, Stanford's own Condi Rice, Stanford's own Coit Blacker, Stanford's own Mike McFall, having gone up to highly visible governmental positions themselves. So thank you for having given me this opportunity to wax nostalgic.
Thank you, George. You've provided such a marvelous outline of the various stages in the development of the program. I'm not sure what I can do to expand that discussion, but I've tried to concentrate a little bit more on the substance of what went on during those years, the whole training component, the activities that we carried out, and the things that made it such an exciting time for all of us. Now, as George has mentioned, the program was inspired by the Rockefeller Foundation's initiative to address worsening Soviet-American relations by trying to promote fresh approaches to the study of Soviet foreign policy and training. And it was also motivated by the desire to create a new cohort of younger specialists to fill the gap created by the retirement of a whole senior generation of specialists, many of whom had their origins in Eastern Europe and were native speakers of the language. There was a competition initially for 2 awards of $1 million each. It was a field that at the time was dominated by Harvard and Columbia and very much centered on the East Coast. And our idea was to create a joint program between our 2 campuses, building on the strengths and complementarities of the 2 programs, and incidentally to draw more national attention to the strength of scholarship and training on the West Coast. So the idea behind the program was to expand the requirements of the PhD training program to combine serious disciplinary training, because we didn't intend to move completely into area studies, but to combine it with an area focus and with a high level of training in Russian language, which had been languishing up until that point. The disciplinary training was meant to include economics, which was always underdeveloped on both our campuses, although Berkeley was very fortunate to have Gregory Grossman as a major member of the faculty and a key contributor to the whole program. And the additional level of funding, much of which was allocated to graduate fellowships, allowed us to attract promising applicants to graduate programs and to create a critical mass between the two campuses. The program involved team teaching of several courses, arrangements allowing students to take courses on either of the two campuses, and many seminars and lectures that were open to both or that moved from one campus to another and that helped to build this atmosphere of collegiality, which we all so enjoyed. And this graduate program, which was far more rigorous than what had existed before, ultimately left our students well positioned to take advantage of the many new opportunities which would open up in the years ahead, both in academia and in government and the NGO community. Now, the inauguration of the program also coincided with major changes taking place in the USSR. The accession of Gorbachev to the Soviet leadership, the initiation of a series of reforms, beginning with glasnost and eventually with perestroika, radically changed the whole environment for training and research and drew growing numbers of talented students into the field. The opening up of the Soviet Union precipitated ever-broadening discussions of topics that were hitherto closed to discussion, as boundaries of a legitimate discourse were pushed ever wider, and they created also unprecedented access to both publications and people. Now, the role of glasnost was to expose, to challenge, and ultimately to undermine many of the dominant myths of the Soviet system. And even though it was not his intention, it challenged the view of the Soviet Union as a fixed and unchanging system. The reforms were a response to critical problems that were at the time confronting the Soviet system. By the mid-1980s, the slowing rates of growth, economic and technological lag, the notion that the country was not adapting to the new scientific technological revolutions of post-industrialism, growth of social pathologies, corruption, a tremendous gap between the self-glorification and the reality, and an international environment which was becoming increasingly tense. And in many ways, Chernobyl, the explosion of the nuclear reactor in Chernobyl, was a catalyst for many of these developments because it became clear once knowledge and information about that event spread beyond the Soviet borders and could no longer be kept from the Soviet population, when the regime realized it could no longer shield the Soviet population from this larger world, it gradually led to growing consensus within the elite on the need for changes, although continuing disagreements on what kinds of changes, and what scope they should have. The first efforts to accelerate economic progress were blocked by the inertia of the system, by ideological strains, by elite resistance to change. And at a critical moment, Gorbachev came to recognize that political change was a precondition for economic reforms, that you needed to harness broader popular support behind his efforts and to try to tap the sources of vitality, dynamism, and innovation outside the framework of official institutions. And part of the strategy then was to seek political support from social forces that were previously excluded from political roles. So glasnost began by expanding the boundaries of permissible public discussion to include an ever broader array of highly sensitive areas, issues that were previously a taboo in Soviet discourse. The whole notion of a single truth conformity to a single party line was gradually undermined by the notion that you could have a socialist pluralism of ideas. But it also undermined the core legitimation of the Communist Party itself as the repository of a single truth. It involved the notion that you could have a certain trust in the population without pretending to infallibility. It involved a notion of official accountability, the use of investigative reporting to expose wrongdoing, and creation of feedback mechanisms. There was a famous statement by Yakovlev at the time that the Soviet leadership, when it came to power under Gorbachev, discovered that they knew very little about the society that they now ruled, and that social science research, public opinion surveys were going to be the channels to finding out more about Soviet society. So a whole series of new themes were opened for discussion in domestic politics and in foreign policy. In a volume that I edited with a Russian colleague at the time called the Glasnost Papers, we tried to, in various chapters, outline the many different areas in which major rethinking was taking place. First of all, there was the whole field of Soviet history, the Stalin-era repressions, the false accusations, the purges, the mass graves, the delegitimation of these past practices created an opportunity for new approaches. But the critique of Stalinism eventually expanded to become a critique of Leninism and eventually of the whole Soviet system, of totalitarianism itself. In economic writings, in the sphere of the economy, a number of economists gradually began to raise questions about the reality of Soviet statistics, the organization of the Soviet economy, whether in fact it was regressing rather than moving forward. The whole area of culture was opened up by a reconciliation with the intelligentsia and ultimately also with the emigration, reuniting two streams of Russian culture which had been separated by the Bolshevik Revolution and by Stalinism. The whole question of the environment came very much to the fore as important sectors of the population, of the intelligentsia, of informal groups began to resist economic decisions which were destroying the natural environment, dumping pollution into the Baikal, cutting down forests, and so on. Religion came to the fore, once again, as a subject for discussion and reevaluation. Social pathologies, things like drug addiction, prostitution, and so on, which had hitherto been treated as legacies of the past, now began to be examined as products of the Soviet system itself. The legal system opened up for examination. The absence of the rule of law in the Soviet Union, the absence of judicial independence. As David has pointed out, foreign policy discussions similarly expanded to a kind of new political thinking which replaced class warfare as the dominant explanation for international events. Even military and security policies were opened to broader discussion, though these topics were still rather sensitive. And then most explosive in the end was the discussion of what was called the national question, not just the delegitimation of past policies and practices in the treatment of national minorities across the Soviet Union, but also an outpouring of long-suppressed grievances about the treatment of history, for example, emphasizing that these were territories that were conquered rather than voluntarily incorporated into the Russian Empire or the Soviet system. Complaints about Russian political and economic domination, complaints about the suppression of languages and cultures, of the different peoples of the USSR. Well, all of the new issues that were now coming to fore created, as we've said, tremendous excitement, which drew ever larger numbers of students to the field. But they also created possibilities of new access to publications and other printed and even unpublished materials, archives, leaflets, brochures, all of which allowed better insight into internal problems and trends and highlighted some of the internal differences on these various topics. New access also included greater access to people. This was a period of expanded exchanges, expanding opportunities for travel and study, opportunities to conduct interviews with various figures in different topics, an easing of constraints and barriers. And it also involved more access to institutions and individuals outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, across different republics and regions. Although access and openness varied greatly among the regions and institutions, you began to see graduate students able to carry out work in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, excuse me, and in Ukraine, although our work on Ukraine was badly underdeveloped at the time. And increasingly, there were opportunities for joint workshops and collaboration on research and publications, not only within our program and with other American institutions, but especially with groups and institutions inside the Soviet Union. The new funds that we received allowed us to invite a number of scholars and journalists and other interesting figures to come to the United States, to come to the West Coast, to visit both campuses, and to spend time with students, giving them access to that world. We created a workshop with a major institute in Moscow, the Bogomolov Institute. And I still recall at the very beginning of this collaboration, this was a major institute that did not have computers or printers at the time. And in order to carry out our collaborative project, I still remember our whole group of faculty and graduate students carrying computer parts and printer parts and other equipment to this research institute in Moscow, helping to set it up so that we could carry out this research, giving some instruction about how to use the internet, and transferring funds to support honoraria in envelopes of cash that we handed over when we arrived. This was before some of these arrangements became easier to carry out. And the access allowed much greater interaction with scholars and others in the Soviet Union itself. You could attend and participate in meetings and forums of scholarly associations. You could join in research on sociology, topics in sociology and topics in public opinion research. You could carry out, to a limited degree, field work on certain kinds of topics. And you could follow the rise of informal groups, what became the Soviet non-governmental organizations and their publications. And for a period of time, we actually were able to bring 2 visiting lecturers from Russia to lecture at Stanford and Berkeley, which was an extraordinary opportunity to hear firsthand what 2 major analysts, young analysts of Soviet politics and foreign policy, how they understood the issues. One was Lilia Shevtsova, who was a very well-known and very popular journalist who gave a very exciting series of lectures. The other was Andrei Kortunov, who worked on Soviet foreign policy. And they taught courses on both campuses, share their own perspectives, engaged in lively discussions with our own students, and at the same time gave them exposure to Western scholarship and Western social science. Both of them spent extended times in bookshops as well as in the library, trying to absorb some of the work that was going on, some of the theoretical models that were being developed among Western scholars. And it led ultimately to some co-authorships of articles and books. But I think most importantly, it affected our views about the Soviet Union because it helped flesh out the more schematic and often stereotypical understandings that we had in academia by looking at studying the Soviet Union from a distance. And this led to a much more nuanced view of different actors, different influence groups, both the forces pushing for changes, the sources of resistance, trying to understand more why there was this, where the resistance came from and why. And these publications and lectures that came out of these projects were disseminated to broader audiences, including policymaking communities both in the United States and in the Soviet Union. A new set of questions emerged as these national movements began to increasingly challenge basic features of the Soviet system, and literature in the West began to focus on questions of the durability of the Soviet system, whether it would survive, and if so, in what form. And here, too, very interesting arguments between two of our faculty members and colleagues, Ken Jawa and Martin Melia, among others who were predicting the disintegration of the Soviet Union, or others who predicted that perhaps the Baltic states would ultimately secede, but the rest would hold together. And then there was a whole other line of scholarship that predicted that the forces of disintegration were going to originate in Central Asia, a view propounded by a number of French and some American scholars, but which proved to be rather wide of the mark. In any case, these by the 1990s, our students, faculty, specialists on the Soviet Union faced completely new challenges for research and training. First, the question of, are we still going to be dealing with the USSR once the Soviet Union had collapsed or had disintegrated or had been brought to an end in 1991? What would be left, and what would we focus on in our research and training? Would we become primarily programs on Russia and Russian studies? Would we try to do research and training that was comparative across the Soviet Union, looking at the way in which these changes were unfolding in different republics of the Soviet Union? Could we do more comparative work with scholars of other transitions from authoritarian rule in Latin America, for example, or in Southern Europe? There was a whole literature on transitions which tried to argue that this was a framework that would be helpful in understanding the Soviet transition and vice versa. And then there was a move ultimately from Russian and East European studies to Eurasian studies as the horizon of what needed to be studied became broader. So those were the intellectual and organizational challenges that 1991 and the period after brought to our programs. Secondly, there was a heightening tensions with the West once Putin came to power, and the growing tensions in Soviet and Russian-American relations, which affected very much graduate training and access to Russia and to some extent, to other republics. As the atmosphere became more chilled, contacts were impeded, official organizing collaborative projects and other kinds of meetings became more difficult. Visa issues rose to the fore, and there were increasing difficulties that limited the possibilities of contacts. And ultimately, foreign policy and security issues came to displace the focus on domestic developments as a key driving factor in Soviet-American relations, which were originally driven to a greater degree by domestic developments. to some extent, historical studies were a little bit less affected by some of these developments. So a major new work became possible with the opening up of archives, studies of topics and historical periods that had hitherto been closed. But in general, the atmosphere and the excitement about the opening up of the Soviet Union, the excitement about making the acquaintance of scholars and fellow students inside the USSR, that began to subside. The excitement in the field began to diminish, and attention shifted to other parts of the world. The rise of Islam, Middle Eastern studies, the study of China in particular. But I think for myself, as for George and others here, this was a particularly exceptionally exciting time to be working in this field. And the Putin era has been something like a splash of cold water compared to our nostalgic memories of that earlier era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both George and Gail. I would now like to introduce our next presenter, Nancy Coleman, who is William H. Bonsall Professor of History here at Stanford. She has been in the department since 1982. Her research focuses on early modern Russia and explores how early modern states, particularly empires, tried to create stability, even social cohesion, by ritual, ideology, law, and the measured use of violence. She comprehensively explores these issues in her most recent book, The Russian Empire, 1450 to 1801, which was published in 2017. She is also author of Crime and Punishment in Early Modern Russia, 1500 to 1725, and Kinship and Politics, The Making of the Muscovite Political System, 1345 to 1547. Nancy served as director of CREASE from the mid-90s until the mid-2000s, and we'll be talking today about navigating this period in the center's history.
Okay, thank you, Jovana. So as Jovana says, I was the CREASE director from 1995-96 to 2006 to 7. So my title, Navigating the 90s, isn't quite accurate. We'll be talking about the whole range of that 10, 12 years that I was able to be director. And as you've heard from George and Gail, these are really exciting times coming out of the 80s into the 90s. And what I want to do today is talk very specifically about the many, many things that CREASE did as a sort of institution. The institution of CREASE is a very dynamic one, where over those years we began to develop a balance of doing our fundamental work of supporting teaching and research here at Stanford and disseminating the knowledge of our Stanford experts out to the real world, and being a kind of rapid response team to whatever new things are happening so that we could cover them in our curriculum or our activities. So I want to talk a lot about the various things we did over those 10, 12 years, and also try to give a shout out to many of the people who actually made it possible, because CREASE in many ways is an umbrella institution that works for and with faculty and graduate students and other engaged people on campus to cover our part of the world. So to start with the first shout outs and nostalgia, I guess, I enjoyed being director immensely because I had the help of two wonderful assistant directors, Irina Barnes, from the beginning of my years to her retirement in the summer of 1999, and then Mary Dakin, who followed her until 2006. And each of them had a deep expertise in our field, each was full of brilliant ideas for conferences and talks, and each was great at networking with all the many people across campus that were engaged in our part of the world. So it was a real delight to work with them. But we also had a fabulous office staff. We had Rosemary Schnur, An Nguyen, who's here, Sue Purdy-Pelosi, and Jack Coleman overseeing the master's program, and many other staff assistants. So it was really a great crew and a terrific office over those many years. And then I was super fortunate to come into the role after the able leadership of Alex Dahlin, Wayne Vucinich, and Norman Naimark. They really put CREASE on an incredibly good foundation in two ways. One is the vision of CREASE that I got to understand from them. Wayne had given us this, imbued in us the importance of giving the many countries of Eastern Europe real attention. And Alex was a real proponent. I think David Holloway was talking about this morning. Alex Dahlin was a proponent of what in those days was called the political culture approach to doing political science. That is, in order to understand the making of policy, you need to know language, culture, history to bear to your policy-making decisions. I think that's gone out of style in the social sciences these days. But at the time, he was a proponent of that. So I got that sense that we should keep CREASE as broad and representative and inclusive an institution as possible with our programs and training. Also, they set us up with tremendous fundraising, which was alluded to this morning, but certainly Wayne, with all those Danube trips, created the Vucinic Endowment, so we had actually an endowment, not just term funds, but an endowment to support our programs. And then Alex was just incredible. He raised money from the Mellon Foundation. He raised money from Donald Kendall, who was, we'll all remember, the CEO of the Pepsi Corporation, which was trying to make early inroads into the Soviet Union. We had Kendall funds for visiting professors and various open-ended things. And so we were, at the time, the envy of the other area centers at Stanford because we had a little bit of money to spend on our programs. This was before Stanford Global Studies. There wasn't a lot of university support for the area centers, and we were so fortunate to have that steady base. And I also then want to say that my years as CREASE director were wonderful because of the many people we had, and we still do, but at the time it was wonderful to have so many people making Russian, East European, and eventually Eurasian Studies at Stanford so strong. And I have in mind, first of all, my faculty in all of the departments: history, Slavic, political science, sociology. Nancy Tuma was representing our field, art history. And then we had what is now called Freeman Spogli Institute, the Institute of International Relations, with CSAC and eventually CDRL. All of these people were great resources for the programs and the teaching that CREASE sponsored. We also had a tremendous library and archive system, which you've heard already about from Bert, and we still do have that today. But in my day at Green, we had Slavic curator Wojciech Zalewski, followed by Karen Rondesvet. They were great at teaching seminars to our master's students on bibliographical resources. Wojciech was the author of many bibliographical surveys of the Stanford collections. They were great at building collections in tune with changing times and with faculty interests. And Zachary Baker in Jewish Studies was supporting our growing program in Jewish Studies. Steve Zipperstein came to campus in the mid-ish 90s doing Russian and East European Jewish history, and Zachary Baker supported the building of that collection. He's here today with us. And now, of course, Margarita Navpaktitis continues in the same way, providing support and information and resources for our faculty and students. So, we are so fortunate. And then, as Bert told us, the Hoover Institution, Library, and Archives were great partners. In my day, Maciej Sikersky, Joe Dwyer, Anatol Shmilyov, they were assembling great collections. They had these local collectors all over our part of the world, buying up ephemera, sending little things. They were working with faculty, and they were great with serving our students. The archive, Elena Danielson and Carol Ledenham, were always there to share the resources and help students. And I'm really glad that Anatol and Bert continue that sort of close connection of the Hoover resources with the people who need to use them. That's faculty, students, and the broader public. So now let me turn to reflecting a bit on the high points of what I recall of CREASE in my years. As you've heard, these years were volatile because of all the political change, but they were super exciting. Instead of just one big center in Moscow kind of shaping how we thought about the area, now we had dozens of sovereign states, foreign policies, geopolitics, different cultures. We had grassroots movements, we had wars, regional conflicts all over the area. We had a fluorescence of local cultures and theater and film, so much to encompass and so much more, I think, to try to corral and make sense of for our students, faculty, and broader public. And as Gail was just talking, archives were opening up for all of us. Survey instruments were becoming possible in the Soviet Union, so much more, the former Soviet Union, so much more could be done. And so what that meant in my years at CREASE was a real explosion of very diverse speakers and courses and problems raised by CREASE programming. We had a lot more, as Gail has already talked a lot about, intellectual interchange. I found in the records before my time, Alex Dahlin had inexhaustible energy. He was trying to organize exchanges. In the first blush of the fall of the Soviet Union, everyone was organizing exchanges, and he was negotiating exchanges between Stanford and research institutions and universities in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Siberia, both, I think, in Novosibirsk and somewhere like Vladivostok. And, you know, nothing too much came of these exchanges because it quickly became clear that the post-Soviet side couldn't pay what we could pay for transport and support of the scholars on either side. But we did get an exchange going that was pretty active with Yuri Afanasyev's new university in Moscow called the Moscow State Humanities University, and they sent several scholars, one of whom was a historian, Alexander Kamensky, who I ended up getting to know quite well, so personally benefited from that connection that Alex forged. By my time, I think we'd realized we don't need formal relationships with institutions in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics because travel was open and we could simply work with individual institutions and scholars to bring them here. So CREASE is always juggling a zillion kinds of things at a time, but you might say they fall into the things that CREASE does fall into some couple of buckets. You know, one would be public outreach, one would be teaching, another supporting research, and fourth might be responding to immediate current events. So I recall many of the things we did in those categories quite fondly. So let me talk first about public outreach. Actually, what I'm going to talk about is our initiative in Ukrainian studies, and that's both public outreach and teaching. So it's a little hard to separate those areas, in fact. There were lots of reasons to do an initiative in building Ukrainian studies here at Stanford. First of all, Robert Conquest at the Hoover Institution had been the world leader into research on the Ukrainian famine, making Stanford a center of interest there. The Orange Revolution riveted everyone's attention to Ukraine in 2004 and 5. And then Alex Dahlin had tried already in the 90s to bring Ukrainian studies to the fore. He got a grant in 1993 from the Committee to Aid Ukraine in Northern California to build Ukrainian studies here. So then when I came into the directorship, I had a personal interest in Ukrainian studies because I'd done my graduate work at Harvard and I was in the early modern centuries, the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. And my Russian professors at Harvard, Professor Ned Keenan, wisely said to me, if you want to understand those centuries of Russian history, you have to understand Ukrainian history. Because Ukrainian history of those early modern centuries is very, very influential on the shaping of cultural, political life up there in the Moscow Center. So I trotted over to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and got a wonderful parallel education in my graduate training, and I stayed in close touch to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute over the years. And when I first came to Stanford, I taught a survey course on Eastern European history in the early modern centuries that had a lot of Ukrainian history in the context of Polish-Lithuanian history as well. So I was really happy to develop Ukrainian studies, and Alex had already laid the foundation with a grant already for Ukrainian language teaching and lectures. So then in 2002, a donor who to this day continues to want to stay anonymous approached us. I had met him through the Harvard connection. We were both serving on a review committee at Harvard, and he said, oh, but you're from California, so am I. And he approached us about building Ukrainian studies here at Stanford, and we negotiated an anonymous fund for lecture series and visiting professors. And those funds allowed us also to have an administrative assistant, Lesia Zarbos. Lesia is still here? Oh, well, Lesia's wonderful. She was fabulous to work with. She administrated the lectures that we did, and she also taught Ukrainian. So for several years, we had visiting professors, at least 6 lectures a year on topics from history to contemporary politics to even economics, and we had several conferences, such as a 2003 conference on the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine. and that anonymous loyal donor continues to support Ukrainian studies at Stanford. A second part of our Ukrainian initiative was a grant from the Chapevsky Family Foundation in 2005 and 6. They donated funds for a visiting professorship from Ukraine to teach Ukrainian studies, and that there was, I think, an expressed preference that that professor come from the Kiev-Mohyla University, and we built a relationship with them, and we had several scholars come to teach or do research in the early 2000s at Stanford. They came in history, literature, economics, and I think we still have an enduring relationship with the Mohyla Academy since then. And so given how important Ukraine is today in American popular news, it's a good thing. I'm very happy that we've been able to give Stanford students and the broader public more knowledge about that important country. And then another totally different way we did outreach was really one of my favorites in my years as a director, and that was our outreach to K through 14 education, that is elementary, middle school, high school, and community college. And this is associated with the fact that we had Title VI funding from the Department of Education from, yet again, Alex Dahlin got our first Title VI grant in 1984. He had incredible energy. That gave us money for programming, FLAS fellowships for graduate training, and a requirement that we do outreach with the expertise we have to the educational community. And so Irina Barnes and then Mary Dakin made these a big focus of their work, and we did 2 different kinds of programs that were a lot of fun. First of all, from 1989, we subvented the production of curricular units, actual hard copy packages for middle and high school students. They're widely distributed in the USA and Canada. The program still exists. We partnered with Stanford area centers on some of them, and some of them we did on our own. But we partnered with SPICE, which is a program over there at FSI, the International Institute for International Relations, Freeman Spogli. SPICE stands for the Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education, and it still exists, still churning out curricular units led by Gary Mukai. So we would subvent the production of a unit in our field, and then the SPICE experts who know pedagogy for middle or high school would then work with one of our faculty and graduate students to produce packages of lesson plans, visual materials, digital materials, and narrative texts. So we supported a lot of these programs, which we really thought had a great impact because they were sold to teachers all across the USA and Canada, and they still continue to be available. And here are the titles of some of the ones. I won't read all the ones that we did, but we did a curricular unit on mapping Russia, geographic and cultural diversity, one on understanding Islam, one on regional wars and peacekeeping, one on inside the Kremlin, Soviet and Russian leaders from Lenin to Putin, one on Central Asia, between peril and promise, one on introduction to Ukraine. So that was one piece of our outreach to the broader community in the educational environment. The second one, also Title VI funded outreach, is that we did day-long workshops for regional high school and community college teachers. So we brought Stanford faculty together to give lectures, and our own graduate students led discussions, and they offered workshops on digital resources and websites. This was in the day when the internet was just kind of beginning as a kind of intellectual resource for us. So this started in 1994. We began to work with BayJEP, which was the Bay Area Global Education Project, who worked in association with the World Affairs Council. And each of the workshop themes was keyed to California standards for education. So these were topics that the teachers were going to have to be teaching anyway in their high school curricula. So I have to give a shout out to some of the faculty who I recall worked with us. Bert Pattenow did at least 3 of these and was really popular. You know, you advertised a workshop with Bert Pattenow, and professors would come, even if they taught American history, they'd come to listen to Bert. And I remember a riveting time, Amir Viner gave lectures in one of our workshops, and it was absolutely fabulous. I'll bet you Norman Neymark did one too, but I'm not sure. So we drew on our resources. But let me give you a listing of some of the topics we did on these workshops. One was a workshop entitled, Is Eastern Europe Obsolete? One was called Siberia and the Russian Far East. One, Understanding Ethnicity and Nationality in the Former Soviet Union. One religion and politics in the former Soviet Union, another one, Islam and politics in the 20th century, and Stalin and the rise of Soviet totalitarianism. These were all day-long workshops that had both lectures and then hands-on, digital or other sort of resource workshops to help these high school teachers. And it's a great way, we were hoping at least, to kind of hook young people into an interest into our part of the world. And then also, I just have to mention this, around 2000, Mary Dakin created as an outreach service a lending library of videotapes of documentaries and films on our part of the world. It seems kind of quaint now. These are the big fat videotapes, that are no longer even done. But it was widely used at the time. People borrowed our videotapes. So that's sort of the area of outreach. We also had a lot of activities around teaching. One achievement that involved CREASE directly, or CREASE supporting faculty who were super involved in this, was the building of overseas campuses. In these years of perestroika and then post-Soviet times, Stanford really pushed to get a presence on the ground in this part of the world. And CREASE, as I say, supported faculty who did the heavy lifting in working with BOSP. It wasn't called BOSP, Bing Overseas Studies program then. It was just Stanford Overseas Studies, but I'll call it BOSP, the current title, just for ease. So anyway, the geography of our overseas study campuses tracks the changing geopolitics of those years. Our first campus was in Krakow, Poland, from 1986 to the spring of 1992. To open it up, BOSP felt they had to close down another campus, so they closed down the beloved Vienna campus, which was one of the original Stanford Overseas Studies campus. And if any of you are Stanford undergrads and you've heard of the annual Viennese Ball, that was founded by students who came back from Vienna, and they said, well, now we know how to waltz, we want to keep having balls, so they do it every year. So no Vienna, we moved to Krakow. We stayed to Krakow in 1992, but things were opening up, and it was more and more possible to have a center in Moscow. And BOSP wanted to be there. Faculty were eager for us to be in Russia. And so we closed Krakow in 1992, and in 1993 to 94 opened a campus in Moscow. It was housed in the Finance Academy, but it was administratively and legally an independent organization. It had its own sort of stamp. It was a legal organization, which must have been an incredibly difficult thing to negotiate. I'll bet Alex was at the heart of the negotiations to get that campus going. So that campus was only 1 quarter long, but it followed the classic Stanford model. There was a Stanford faculty member living there who taught 1 or 2 courses. Between 15 and 20 students went every autumn, studied with the faculty that were assembled from local experts who could teach in English. We had funds from Helen Bing to take study trips to St. Petersburg and one other location. The students had homestays, internships, trips to the ballet and museum and local culture. And the program could not have thrived without the active participation of so many of our faculty who lived in an apartment near Metro Voykova and taught at the program. But I have to have a shout out to our incredibly talented and hardworking language faculty. Zhenya Hasina and Rima Greenhill worked really hard with the language teachers over there in Moscow to make them bring their program up to Stanford standards. They visited Moscow several times to train the teachers there and share curriculum so that our students could go. And many students went early, they arrived a little early. They started beginning Russian in late August. They started taking first-year Russian and living in an immersive context over the autumn quarter, and when they came back, they seamlessly went into second-year Russian. It was that good a program. They'd made that much progress, and Zhenya and Rima had made it that possible for the programs to intersect that way. So this program lasted in 2003 when BOSP closed it down for, quote, high fixed costs and low student enrollment, which is true. We only had 1 quarter, whereas most of the other overseas campuses can manage 3 quarters, but no one seemed to want to go to Moscow campus from January through March for good reason. So anyway, all of us faculty responded right away, and to their credit, BOSP was very responsive, and with a lot of networking by Mike McFall and others, we found a new location and an arrangement that suited BOSP more. We had a redesigned Moscow campus already by the autumn of 2005, sponsored in part by and housed in Vladimir Mao's Academy of National Economy. They provided more infrastructure and financial arrangements. It was less of a heavy lift for BOSP. And that campus lasted until 2013, and BOSP closed it down for financial and administrative reasons. So now moving beyond my time as director, but I'll just finish up the story, we faculty all then protested again. How can you leave BOSP without a program of presence in Russia, or at least Eastern Europe, someplace in our part of the world? And BOSP in principle agrees, and BOSP is now, with the help of Gabriela Safran, now is really working hard on this project for the last 3 or more years, has been working hard with BOSP to redesign a program perhaps in St. Petersburg. But also BOSP has been very responsive by letting Stanford faculty do these 3-week-long overseas seminars to Russia. Jack and I have led overseas summertime seminars to Petersburg 5 or 6 times. Gabriela's led them once and is going again this coming year, so that BOSP is responsive to keeping a presence for our students to get to that part of the world. But thanks, Gabriela, for your efforts, and we will get ourselves back to a campus in the Russian Federation eventually. So back to my years at CREASE in this area of teaching support. During my years, we developed other opportunities for Stanford undergrads to visit Russia other than the Moscow campus with Mike McFall's help. From about 2002 to at least 2005, Stanford and government, the Haas Center, and CREASE joined forces to create a summer internship at the Carnegie Moscow Center, which Mike was closely associated with. And that internship then is paralleled now by the Stanford Global Studies internships, where people have been going to Estonia and Ukraine over summer times recently. Another element in our supportive teaching is that we put in a lot of funds, CREASE funds, Title VI funds, for supporting courses that were new in areas we didn't already have faculty or curriculum in, or courses that wouldn't normally be taught. So for example, we use Title VI funds to subvent the teaching of underrepresented languages like Polish, Czech, Ukrainian, Hungarian, whatever Stanford students requested. This is done through the Special Languages Program at the DLCL, but it had to be paid for by somebody, and CREASE stepped in to make sure, particularly our grad students, could have the language training they needed. For several years of these transitional years, we worked with the economics department to support a course on post-Soviet transitional economics. For several years, we paired with the history department to have Jack Coleman teach a course on popular religion in Russia, because there wasn't any other attention to Russian religion and orthodoxy in our curriculum. We collaborated with other area studies in a lot of things, but one of the ones in the teaching area was that I collaborated with another director, Richard Roberts, who at that time was the director of the Center for African Studies, and we created a course called Design and Method of International Field Research. It wasn't paid for by CREASE, it was paid for by the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. We had a TA with the course. But the point of the course was not area content, but method. We were giving students exposure to some of the things they should be thinking about and being aware of when they're going abroad to do research in a foreign country. And the departments, we didn't think were doing a great job of it, and we knew that this would help our MA students as well. So it was initially aimed at MA students and PhD students in area studies and the departments. So we talked a lot about ethics, the many ethical dilemmas you will confront when you go abroad. We talked about human studies protocol, which was something that some students had never heard of, but they certainly needed to get permission for. We talked about methodological training. That course existed from 1996 until just this past year, and over time, the departments began to pick up the slack of training their own PhD students, but Stanford then started putting more and more money into undergraduate research, and our enrollment became undergrads who were going abroad. to do research. Oh, 2 more minutes. Okay, sorry. And then I want to say we expanded our course offerings after 9/11. We started having more courses on the non-Slavic parts of the empire. Gail taught us a course on geopolitics of Central Asia. John Dunlop taught a course on Russia and Islam, and Alma Kunanbayeva and Isali Zemsovsky came to Stanford, and she taught Kazakh. She taught courses on Central Asian folklore and all of that, and we did a lot of outreach in Central Asia. Another aspect of our supportive teaching and outreach was our MA program, but Gabriella will talk about that later, so I won't say anything more about it other than to say that we had, as we still do, we had wonderful cohorts of students who were really fun to work with, and the great thing about the MA program was that Jack kept the standards, the admission standards. He sort of policed the gates. I mean, there's a faculty committee that did the admissions. He advised students enough to tell them that the standards were high so that we had really, really good qualified students who came in then to the PhD level classes and did really quite well. So faculty were very happy to have CREASE MA students in their grad classes, and they continue to be so today. CREASE also supported faculty and grad student research with supporting the history department, Kruzhok on history, a reading group on Russian Orthodoxy, all manner of things. I skimmed back through the flyers for all the lectures we gave during the years I was director, and I was really afraid it would be all Russia all the time because the Soviet Union just collapsed, but it was still like the big story. But I was very gratified to see that we had programs on not just Russian topics, but Poland, Nagorno-Karabakh, the Caucasus, Chechnya, the Czech lands, Central Asia, and the Balkans. We continued to be really quite broad. We had lots of supported departments in their various conferences. Grisha Fradin had conferences on Russia at the end of the 20th century, and the Babil conference that we'll learn about. We had conferences in honor of Uncle Wayne, a conference, the retirement of Terry Emmons, all of which produced publishable papers and books. So CREASE has subvented a lot of research. And we had a lot of quick, rapid response panel discussions in response to current events. I remember one on the outbreak of the Second Chechen War, one on the collapse of the Soviet Union, one on the Orange Revolution. And here, I just have to say we were so lucky to be able to turn to such experts in current day events as David Holloway, Chip Blacker, Condi Rice, John Dunlop, Gale, Grisha, Norman Neymark, Mike McFall, Catherine Stoner, and many other experts on campus. So in conclusion, I just want to affirm the vision of area studies. And we will talk about that later too. I think all of the lands that fall into our purview are very various, and they're all carving new geopolitical presences for themselves. The Baltic lands are becoming part of a Baltic world, and the Central Asian republics are more part of maybe gravitating towards the Middle East and all of that. But still, and you might say that it's a kind of archaic relic of the Cold War that we still study all of these areas all in one big center. But they still need to be studied. And the way we study them with depth of culture, language, history to inform our current day understanding, I think is the right way to go. And we have all of these resources here at Stanford to be qualified to do that. And I was very, very honored to work with such wonderful colleagues and to contribute to all of that work of making sense for our part of the world for the broader public. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And that is really an amazing and impressive range of activities that you've highlighted.
Yeah, you guys
So I feel like there's one more person who needs a shout out here, and that's you.
Oh, no.
So it's our great pleasure to welcome today Amelia Glaser, who comes to us from the University of California, San Diego, flew in this morning, where she is associate professor in the Department of Literature. Although this is a homecoming of sorts for Amelia, because prior to going to UC San Diego, she was a PhD student here in comparative literature and also a lecturer at CREASE. Her research and teaching interests include Russian literature and film, transnational Jewish literature, and the literatures of Ukraine. She is author of Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands, from the Shtetl Fair to the Petersburg Bookshop, and also edited Stories of Khmelnytsky, Competing Literary Legacies of the 1648 Ukrainian Cossack Uprising, and also Comintern Aesthetics, which is forthcoming still.
This year, hopefully this year.
Okay.
It's in a few months.
And also, while a graduate student at Stanford, participated in the exhibition on Babel at the Hoover Library and Archives, and will be speaking on Babel today.
Thank you. I should add that my co-editor for the Comintern Aesthetics volume is Stephen Lee, who's now a professor at Berkeley and was also a student at Stanford when I was in a CREASE affiliate.
So the collaboration continues.
The collaboration continues, yes, although now it's within the UCs. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an honor to be included in this conference and in this panel. I've learned so much today already about the history of the institution where I received my graduate degree, but also about the history of the field. And of course, it's just lovely to be back to get to see my mentors, people like Monica Greenleaf and Gabriela Safran, Zachary Baker, people that have, opened my mind in amazing ways. So thank you. It feels a little insane to come down for the day, but I cannot say no to an offer to come and participate in a conference at Stanford, especially from CREASE. So CREASE played a really important role in my graduate career between 1998 and 2004. CREASE Fellowship sent me to Russia during summers, giving me space to get to know scholars there, to begin research, to continue side artistic endeavors that would deepen my engagement with the place that I was studying. And then, of course, I also returned to CREASE in 2005, 2006, and got to teach a couple of courses involving Ukraine. So I was invited here to reminisce about my involvement in one particular CREASE endeavor 15 years ago, the conference called The Enigma of Isaac Babel, for which I was one of 3 graduate assistants. It'll give me an excuse to talk a little bit also about maybe the relevance of Babel and Babel's enigma to Ukraine today, which is something that I'm beginning to think about in the context of a very, very new project for me. So I was one of 3 assistants for this conference. There was an exhibit, there was an amazing conference, and there was a play, the first staging of the play Maria in the US. The most important role of the graduate student assistants was in putting together an exhibit at the Hoover Pavilion that would highlight the life and work of this phenomenal writer of short fiction, Isaac Babel, a writer, of course, who came of age with the revolution and whose life was cut short in 1940. I'm not sure exactly how I was convinced to do this while I was racing to finish my dissertation, but most likely, like my fellow grad students, Elif Batuman and Josh Walker, I was charmed by the force of persuasion of our professor, Grisha Freden, who convinced us that it would be good for us. And of course, he was right. Elif wrote an essay, in my opinion, a perfect essay, a really beautiful essay. I reread it the other day, that helped launch her literary career. Josh, whose middle name is Sky, became known the world over as Skywalker, thanks to Elif's essay. And I became infected with an even deeper fascination and understanding of Isaac Babel than I already had, not only with his chilling short fiction, but also as a way of understanding the many contradictory and creatively fruitful intersections of East European culture. It was more than just an assistantship. I think we were paid something to help put together this exhibit, but Grisha actually gave us an experience that was a kind of deep dive into Isaac Babel's life and work. Alongside this experience working with him in Hoover, with the white gloves, gathering materials for the exhibit, he was running an unofficial, off the books course on Isaac Babel and his work in his office that several of us participated participated in. And, at one point he required us to come with him to San Francisco to the Marc Chagall exhibit that was taking place there. So it was a very all-consuming education into Isaac Babel that we were engaged in that year. Nonetheless, our primary job was this exhibit. And so I went back into my file-marked old files on my laptop that I still have. And here are some of the labels we had in the Babel cases for the exhibit. An essay about Pushkin, for which Babel received the grade of A-, parentheses, C. Freyden for credit. An early edition of Lyubka the Cossack, Hoover Archive, Holtzman Collection. Map of the city of Odessa, 1919, from the recent book, Где обрывается Россия. A picture of the Great Synagogue of Odessa, from a book published in 1895. A photo of victims of the October pogrom in Odessa, 1905. A page from Babel's diary in which he talks about having been to the theater. So Babel would remain an enigma to me, as to so many of us, long after the conference. His work made up the final chapter of my dissertation on images of marketplaces in Russian, Yiddish, and Ukrainian literature, and the final chapter of the book that emerged from that, which was a literary history of the intersections present in the Pale of Settlement. Babel and his enigma, I believe, embodies the intersection at the heart of Stanford's CREASE program, at least from the perspective of a literature scholar. He is a Russian writer among Jews. He is a Jewish writer among Russians. And he's a Soviet writer who immortalized the Ukrainian landscape at the moment that landscape was being overwritten by revolution. I finished my dissertation that spring of 2004, shortly after the Babel conference, and immediately after that had a short postdoc at the Harvard Ukrainian Institute, which Nancy's already mentioned, arguably the second best place to be during the fall of 2004, when the Orange Revolution took place. So for the past 15 years, and especially for the past 5 years of war, as Ukraine has urgently sought to distance itself from Russia and from Soviet history, I've noticed that Babel again represents a very particular kind of enigma for Ukraine. And the current political situation has prompted me to return to him. Boris Khersonsky, a poet living and writing in Odessa in Russian, and more recently he's actually shifted to Ukrainian, wrote a poem about Babel in 2011, and I'll say just the very beginning of it here. It's called Товарищ Исаак Бабель пишет историю города О. The comrade Isaac Babel writes the history of the city O. Товарищ Исаак Бабель пишет историю города О. Крупные жемчужины у черного М. По этому тексту будут снимать кино. Товарищ Бабель величает товарища Сталина, но Бабеля расстреляют полностью и насовсем. So very rough translation. Comrade Babel writes the history of the city O, the Great Pearl by the Black Sea. They'll make a movie from this text. Comrade Babel exalts Comrade Stalin, although they will shoot Babel completely and forever. In her essay about Babelians at Stanford, Elif Batuman wrote, every biography is a mystery story, a whodunit. Here is the life, now give me the person who did it. The whodunit of Khersonsky's career thus far is not quite as shifting as that of Babel, but arguably it comes close. Over the last decade, he's shifted from expressing pride in his Odessa Jewish heritage toward frustration with and even anger toward all of Soviet literature. Khersonsky has spoken of his own reassessment of Babel, Bagritsky, and others. In a recent interview, he stated, they were all, with the exception of Jabotinsky and Kataev at the end of his life, talented but Soviet writers. Khersonsky explains Babel's allegiance to the Cheka as a desire to live safely. And yet Khersonsky's condemnation of Babel serves as a measure for naming a particular elephant in the room. What can we do with Soviet literary history, including its great literature, in light of the current struggle between Russia and Ukraine? I had to think a lot about this a month ago when I went to a conference in Odessa and wanted to talk about the great history of certain Soviet writers. So I want to use the remainder of my time to rehearse a response to Khersonsky, or rather a response to our current moment of heightened national antagonisms, by suggesting that Babel, a Soviet Russian Jewish, and yes, like Khersonsky, Ukrainian writer can still be read fruitfully as a purveyor of multiple national realities simultaneously. There's a lot at stake right now. Ukraine is trying to consider itself a democratic space. So what I'm doing right now, I'm actually in the process, I'm at the beginning of a new project where I'm attempting to read in very recent literature from Ukraine from the last 5 years, an understanding of the shift in Ukrainian identity or in collective imagination. And I'm noticing, for the most part, a redefinition of the Ukrainian from a kind of national identity to a more democratic multinational identity. But then you also have cases like Khersonsky, where there's a movement from the more cosmopolitan toward more of a national Ukrainian identity, fascinatingly. So if you go on Google Maps right now, Google Maps Russia, you will find different borders of Ukraine from the borders that you'll find on Google Maps US or Google Maps in Ukraine. And at the time Isaac Babel was writing, the Russo-Polish War exaggerated the historically conflicted cartographies of the Jewish Pale of Settlement, Poland's historical Rzeczpospolita, Tsarist Russia's Malorossiya, and the Ukrainian Hetmanate. So maps of Ukraine couldn't be trusted any more at the time than they can be trusted right now. Nor could they be trusted any more than Babel's traveling narrators, who often recount impossible or inconsistent events, misinform their interlocutors about geography, and lie about their ethnic identities. In one of the episodes in the Red Cavalry cycle, The Son of Italy, the narrator Lutov realizes that his roommate, Sidorov, has gone mad when he finds a picture of the Roman Forum and a map of Rome among his papers. Fragments of a letter show that Sidorov, who has joined the Red Army after fighting on the side of Makhno's Ukrainian anarchists, is unable to accept Soviet Ukraine, which as of 1919 had its capital in Kharkiv rather than Kiev. Sidorov is skeptical of what he calls this self-proclaimed capital. Sidorov has mentally left Ukraine for Italy, a country he has never seen. Italy has entered my heart as an obsession, he admits in a letter in this Red Cavalry cycle. His escape to Italy is an escape from the nascent Bolshevik Ukraine, but it's also an exaggeration of the territorial ambiguity of war-torn Ukraine. Lutov, the narrator, might be on the side of revolution, but he is not unsympathetic. He finds Sidorov's map of the Roman ruins while observing the ruins of Novograd, a town that Babel has placed on the banks of the Zbruch. The city, as Fredin made sure that we understood during this unofficial course in his office in 2004, could not possibly have been located on the banks of the Zbruch. It was on the banks of the Sluch. So could it be that Babel, the author, like Sidorov and unlike Lutov, had also found a way to leave the reality of war, replacing the map of the Ukrainian-Polish borderlands with something out of his imagination? Or was he making space for the continued reality of other geographies, even as the Bolsheviks conquered and reorganized Ukraine? Isaac Babel first mixes up the two rivers, the Zbruch and the Sluch, at the beginning of the Red Cavalry cycle by declaring that Lutov's unit enters Novograd-Volynsk by crossing the Zbruch. In actuality, the Zbruch has no physical role in the battle over Novograd-Volynsk, as Charles Rugel observed. The Zbruch, however, has considerable symbolic value as a border. So for crossing the Zbruch meant encroaching on Polish territory. So by insisting upon Novograd's place on the banks of the Zbruch throughout the cycle, and by opening a window simultaneously to ancient Rome and the ruins of Novograd, Babel exaggerates Ukraine as a site that held deep meaning for multiple groups. Stephen Siegel, who applies Mary Louise Pratt's conception of contact zones to cartography in Ukraine, has observed that these conflicting geographies, quote, commemorating the land of Ukraine territorially is never an easy ordeal, concretely or abstractly. One must warn duly against strict constructivism and backward projections of identity essentialism. So these cartographic contact zones made Ukraine an ideal home for a literature where the idea of what is real always remained relative. If this fed, on the one hand, the Soviet concept of an untrustworthy Ukrainian territory, it calls into question, on the other, the idea of an absolute geographical truth, as declared by Moscow. The borders of the Pale of Settlement shifted several times between 1791 and 1917, and thus, for example, Jewish cultural or linguistic borders never mapped perfectly onto the natural borders of the Tsarist Empire. These borderlands confound simple questions like atkuda or ktovwe. Babel works within multiple maps in Red Cavalry. Lutov is a different person depending on where he is, and the territory is different depending on who knows it. Babel's character, like the author, employs his murky borderlands identity by confusing his interlocutors. To the rabbi who asks, "Откуда приехал еврей?" "Чем занимается еврей?" and so forth, Lutov studies the Bible and seeks merriment. To the Poles whose Rzecz Pospolita he is destroying, Lutov is a violent intruder. Myths and misconceptions affect how maps are read. Babel exploits these myths, at the same time exposing the very possibility of geographical myth-making. As Eric Prieto has suggested, it's precisely the imaginative dimension of fictional representation that gives it its peculiar form of power over the real. Babel's exoticized characters, from the Cossack Prishopa, who has fled the whites, to the commander Kolesnikov, who bears the despotic indifference of a Tatar Khan, may delight his readers, but they also make fools of them. Ukraine, part of Russia's south, is desirable. It is also unknowable. As a Ukrainian Jew, Babel is part of this unknowable south. He is in this sense like Herschele, the trickster from Jewish lore, who in an exaggerated manipulation of boundaries exploits an innkeeper's wife's murky understanding of tradition when he exclaims, "Это я и есть Shabbos Nachamu." Shabbos Nachamu is, of course, not an individual, but an obscure feast day, and by tricking his dim-witted interlocutor, Herschele convinces her to give him food and supplies that she's been saving for the holiday. The invented reality of Babel's fiction creates its own reality, and like the diverse maps that superimpose themselves onto the geography of the Russian Empire, the fictional worlds of Babel and his characters possess their own cartography and internal inconsistencies. So this approximate mapping of the territory bears some resemblance to the approximate borders that define East European Jewish geography, borders that have never been in perfect harmony with state borders. A Jew from the town of Chernigov, now Ukraine, would have Ukrainian neighbors, but would know his town to be a Lithuanian shtetl. For citizens of the multi-ethnic borderlands of empire, there's always another reality lying just below the surface. By offering tales of a chaotic Ukraine to his readers, Babel embodies the role of a good cosmopolitan, but he also embodies the role of a traduttore traditore, the untrustworthy translator. We see this clearly in his 1932 story, Daroga, a story that he claims to have written between 1920 and 1930. Am I doing okay? Yes, I have 2 minutes. Is that right? Okay. So we see this especially clearly in this story where the narrator is making his way, presumably from Odessa, through Kiev, and finally to Petersburg, and sees ethnically marked bodies oozing out onto the road. The story appears to be the chronicle of an escape from chaotic Ukraine to civilized Petrograd. However, as Gregory Fradin has observed, the wanderer narrator is actually moving to Petrograd to conquer Petersburg as a writer. He claims to work for the Foreign Division of the Cheka, which did not exist in 1917-18. The story itself hovers on the border between an exemplary socialist autobiography and grotesque fiction. In Babel's stories, Ukrainian Jews, historical mediators between lords, peasants, Cossacks, and Russians, become exemplary Bolshevik believers. The revolutionary moment of internationalist idealism gives these characters a chance to enjoy the spoils of a previously hostile empire. Together with his comrade Kalugin, the narrator of Doroga happily smokes the Tsar's cigarettes and takes on his assignment as a Cheka translator. But there's a gnawing sense in this story that such veselye, such merriment, can only be short-lived. After all, this merriment began 13 years ago, and the unlucky number can't bode well. Could Babel be suggesting that his time in the sun is over? A translator's appreciation of the many versions of the landscape of the new Soviet Union is itself dangerous. As the mujik in Zamosh complains to Lutov, it's all the fault of those yids. They try to please everyone. Babel, like his narrators, translators of the borderlands, sympathizes with all sides too well. Well, Babel's cosmopolitans, from Panapolik to Luke the Cossack to Karl Jankel, bridge peoples by refusing to adhere to a single national identity. They're renegades in their willingness to break national rules, and they are new types, as Gabriela Safran has put it, in their embodiment of internationalism. If we accept that Babel's strange characters were at least partially in keeping with the desired internationalist aim of Soviet literature in the 1910s and 1920s, then we must also observe that in the 1930s, when there was less room to flirt with the borders of truth and realism, there was also less room for ambiguous nationalities and approximate gaps. I have no need to quarrel with Khersonsky, whose shift toward Ukrainian nationalism and rejection of an Odessa Jewish cosmopolitanism I find completely fascinating at this moment in time. However, I do like to read Khersonsky's quarrel with Babel in light of this long change in maps within the region that both of them come from. I believe that this quarrel may not be with the writer that he once loved, but with the national supremacy and neo-imperialism that encroached upon literary freedom by the mid-1930s, leaving no room for Odessa cosmopolitanism.